There's a boat sitting on the desert floor outside Las Vegas. A real one. Fiberglass hull, propeller still bolted to the stern, bow pointed at nothing but cracked mud and sun-bleached rock. It didn't wash up there. It sank. Decades ago, in water deep enough to swallow it whole, and for years nobody knew it was down there. Then the water left. Foot by foot, season by season, Lake Mead pulled back from its own shoreline until that boat stood upright in the open air, like a tombstone nobody planted. Look at the canyon walls around it. You'll see the ring. A pale white band, stark against the darker rock below, wrapping the whole reservoir like a bathtub somebody forgot to scrub. That white line is mineral crust, left behind by water that used to be there and isn't anymore. At its widest, the stain climbs higher than a 15-story building. That's how far the lake has fallen. That's how much water is simply gone. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. Lake Mead isn't a lake in the way you're picturing it. It's a bank account. The single largest reservoir in the United States, holding back the Colorado River behind Hoover Dam, feeding the taps, the farms, and the power grid of roughly 40 million people across 7 states and part of Mexico. Phoenix drinks from it. Los Angeles pipes it clear across the desert. The lettuce in your winter salad, the almonds, the alfalfa, fed to cattle 1,000 miles away. A huge share of it grows, because that river shows up on schedule. Except, the river isn't showing up like it used to. So sit with 2 questions, because everything ahead hangs on them. First, how does a river this big, this important, watched this closely by engineers and lawyers and satellites, quietly slide toward the edge of collapse without most of the country even noticing? And second, there's a specific number, an elevation on the face of these dams where the machinery stops working entirely, and the water essentially stops moving downstream. A line the river has never crossed in the modern era. Federal projections now put us alarmingly close to it. What happens on the day the Colorado reaches that line? Hold on to both of those. They come back around. And the answers are worse than the questions sound. Let me widen the lens for a second, because the boat is just one snapshot. Drive the shoreline of Lake Mead today, and you pass boat launch ramps that dead end in dirt. Concrete slabs poured down toward the water, now stopping 50, 100, 200 feet short of anything wet. Marinas have been hoisted onto floating pontoons and dragged deeper into the basin, chasing a lake that keeps retreating from them. In 2022, the receding water gave up more than a stranded boat. Human remains surfaced. A barrel with a body inside it. Skeletal remains at a place called Swim Beach. Cold cases from decades back. Exposed because the lake that hid them evaporated out from under the secret. When a reservoir starts handing back the dead, you're not looking at a dry spell. You're looking at something structural. Now zoom all the way out. Forget the single lake for a moment. Picture the whole artery. The Colorado River starts high in the Rocky Mountains, up where the snow piles deep all winter. That snowpack is the entire game. When spring warms the peaks, the melt runs down into the river, and that river carves southwest through Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, brushing New Mexico and Wyoming, feeding California, before it crosses into Mexico and, in theory, reaches the Gulf of California. I say in theory because for most years now, the Colorado River doesn't actually reach the sea anymore. It gets used up. Diverted, pumped, drained, delivered so thoroughly that by the time it nears its own delta, there's often nothing left but dry channel and salt flat. A river that carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years now routinely dies of thirst before it finishes its own journey. That should stop you cold. We're not talking about a stream. We're talking about the plumbing for the entire American Southwest, one of the fastest growing regions in the country, and we've engineered it so completely that the river's natural ending, the ocean, has been erased. 2 giant reservoirs hold the whole arrangement together. Lake Powell sits upstream, behind Glen Canyon Dam. Lake Mead sits downstream, behind Hoover Dam. Together, they were built to be the buffer, the savings account, the cushion that carries the region through the dry years by banking the wet ones. Fill them in the good times, draw them down in the bad. That was the design. And for decades, it worked. The lakes stayed high, the boats floated, the turbines spun, and 40 million people turned on their faucets without a second thought about where the water came from. Then the 21st century arrived, and the math started to break. Because here's what almost nobody outside the water agencies fully grasps. The two reservoirs, at their lowest, have sat at a fraction of what they can hold. Lake Powell dropping to around a quarter of capacity. Lake Mead not far behind. These aren't lakes running a little low for the summer. These are the two largest reservoirs in the country, the backbone of water for a seventh of the nation's population, running near empty at the same time. And the water managers have specific, terrifying elevation markers painted onto the whole system. The point where hydropower stops, and below that, the point where water can no longer pass through the dam at all. The industry has a name for that lower one: dead pool. When a reservoir hits dead pool, the dam still stands. It just stops delivering. The water that's left sits trapped behind concrete, unable to flow to the cities and farms waiting downstream. For 100 years, dead pool was a hypothetical. A worst-case scenario engineers sketched on paper and filed away, confident they'd never see it. That confidence is gone. The federal government's own studies now chart a path where the numbers cross those lines, and the people who run this river have started saying the quiet parts out loud, that the system, as built, may not survive another dry decade. So how did we get here? How does a river get promised away faster than it can flow? The answer starts with a document signed more than 100 years ago, by men who badly, catastrophically misjudged how much water the Colorado actually carries. November 1922. A lodge just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. 7 men, 7 states, 1 river to divide, and a federal negotiator named Herbert Hoover. Yes, that Herbert Hoover. Leaning hard on them to sign before anyone goes home. They had a river to split. What they didn't have was an honest number for how much water was actually in it. Here's the mistake that still poisons everything downstream. To split the Colorado, they needed the average annual flow, so they grabbed the records they had, measurements from the previous 2 decades or so. Mostly off a gauge at Lease Ferry, Arizona. Those records said the river carried somewhere around 16 to 17 million acre-feet a year. Sounds precise. It wasn't. Because the years they'd measured, roughly 1905 through the early 1920s, happened to be some of the wettest the basin had seen in centuries. Let that sink in. They calibrated the entire legal skeleton of the American Southwest during a freak wet streak. Tree ring studies done decades later, scientists coring ancient bristlecone pines and Douglas firs to read the rainfall history written right into the wood, showed the long-term average is closer to 13 or 14 million acre-feet. In some centuries, a lot less. The men in that room built their math on a number inflated by 2, maybe 3 million acre-feet of phantom water. Water that existed on paper. Water that never reliably existed in the channel. And they gave it all away anyway. The 1922 compact cut the river in 2. An upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico. And a lower basin, Arizona, Nevada, California, each half got 7. 5 million acre-feet a year. That's 15 million right there, before you count Mexico's share, which a separate 1944 treaty later pegged at another 1.5 million acre-feet crossing the border. Do the math. 15 plus 1.5 is 16.5 million acre-feet promised to somebody every single year. Against a river that on a good long-term average delivers maybe 14. You don't need a hydrology degree to spot the trap. They promised out more water than the river carries. And not by a rounding error. By an amount bigger than everything the state of Arizona is legally entitled to draw. The whole system was born overdrawn, an account written to bounce the moment the wet years quit. For a while, the flaw stayed buried. Nobody actually used their full allotment early on, because the infrastructure to move the water didn't exist yet. The upper basin states were empty. Los Angeles was a fraction of its future self. Phoenix and Las Vegas? Dusty outposts. So the river ran with slack in it. The overdraft was theoretical because demand hadn't caught up to the paper. The bill hadn't come due. Then came the dams. The canals. The astonishing, relentless growth. Hoover Dam rose in the 1930s, plugging the river to create Lake Mead. Glen Canyon Dam followed in the 1960s, backing up Lake Powell. Those two reservoirs became the savings accounts of the Southwest, enormous buffers holding tens of millions of acre-feet, smoothing out the dry years with water banked from the wet ones. And behind that cushion, the desert cities detonated. Phoenix went from a town of 65,000 in 1940 to a metro of nearly 5 million today. Las Vegas grew from a railroad stop into 2.3 million people, a city that gets less than 4 inches of rain a year and drinks almost entirely from Lake Mead. Southern California hauled a river's worth of water across the desert through the Colorado River Aqueduct just to keep San Diego and Los Angeles breathing. Every one of those straws plugged into the same overpromised river. And for decades, the reservoirs stayed full enough to hide the arithmetic. Mead and Powell sat near capacity through much of the 20th century. The bathtub rings hadn't formed yet. People built and moved and planted and drilled, all on the assumption that the water was simply there. A permanent feature of the map, like the mountains. Then, around the year 2000, the taps started closing. What hydrologists now call the millennium drought, or, more bluntly, the mega drought, settled over the whole basin and refused to leave. Not a bad year, not even a bad decade. Studies out of the University of California and NASA have flagged the stretch from 2000 onward as the driest 22-year period in the Southwest in at least 1,200 years. 12 centuries. You'd have to go back past the fall of the Anasazi Cliff cities to find dirt this thirsty for this long. And here's the crueler part. It's not just less rain and snow. It's heat. Every degree of warming pulls more moisture out of the soil, off the reservoir surfaces, out of the snowpack before it ever melts into a stream. Scientists call it aridification, and that word matters enormously. A drought ends. You wait. The rains come back. The reservoirs refill. Aridification resets the baseline. It's the river getting permanently smaller because the atmosphere itself is thirstier. Some estimates say the Colorado has already lost around 20% of its flow compared to the 20th century average, and a big chunk of that loss is driven by temperature, not rainfall. Meaning even a wet winter can't fully claw it back. So look at the collision now. On one side, a legal framework promising 16.5 million acre-feet a year, a number that was fantasy even in 1922. On the other side, a river now delivering, in the bad years, barely more than half of that. And caught in between, 40 million people, millions of acres of farmland, and 2 enormous reservoirs that have been quietly draining to pay the difference. That's the thing about a savings account. It only works until you're pulling out more than you put in, year after year after year. And that's exactly what's been happening on the Colorado for more than 2 decades. The system has been running a structural deficit, using more water than flows in, and papering over the gap by draining Mead and Powell. The reservoirs weren't just holding water. They were absorbing the mistake. Every foot the water dropped was the 1922 overdraft finally being paid, in real time, out of the only reserve the West had left. By 2022, both lakes had crashed to around a quarter of capacity. Lake Mead hit its lowest level since it was first filled back in the 1930s. Lake Powell slid toward the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer spin its turbines, the point where the West loses the river's hydropower before it even loses the river's water. And the Federal Bureau of Reclamation, the agency that actually runs these dams, did something it had never done in the compact's entire history. It told the 7 states, cut your usage dramatically, or we'll cut it for you. Think about the growth curve underneath all this, because that's what makes the math truly merciless. The supply line trends down, smaller flows, hotter years, thinner snowpack. The demand line trends up, more people flooding into Phoenix, more subdivisions in the desert, more almond and alfalfa acreage soaking up irrigation across the Imperial Valley and beyond. 2 lines, running in opposite directions, and they crossed a long time ago. We've just been living on the reservoir cushion that hid the crossover. That cushion is nearly gone. So when officials talk about water cuts for 40 million people, they're not describing some possible future crisis falling out of the sky. They're describing the bill for a 100-year-old accounting error finally landing, with a century of compound interest and a warming climate stapled to the invoice. The men at that lodge divided a river they measured wrong. Every generation since inherited the shortfall, shoved it downstream, and built more anyway. Now there's nowhere left to shove it. The next dry winter doesn't just lower a lake. It forces a reckoning that 7 states have spent a century refusing to have. That boat on the cracked mud near Colville Bay didn't sink in some ancient storm. It went down in the 1970s, in water. For 50 years it sat on the bottom, invisible, while houseboats floated 100 feet above it. Then the lake pulled back and left it standing there like a headstone. And that is the whole story in one image. The past surfacing because the present ran dry. The people who manage this river know exactly what the boat means. So in May 2026, they did something the Colorado has almost never seen. Arizona, Nevada, and California, the 3 states of the lower basin, signed off on an emergency water transfer, moving supply through the system to hold Lake Powell above the line where Glen Canyon Dam's turbines die. Engineering News Record covered it plainly. The states cleared an emergency deal because the system was closing in on the hydropower floor. That's the tell. When rivals who've sued each other for a century start cutting rush deals in a conference room, the crisis isn't coming. It's here. Look at the Bureau of Reclamation's own math, and the panic makes sense. Their May 2026 24-month study projects Lake Powell crossing minimum power pool, 3,490 feet, in December 2026. First time ever. 63 years of filling and draining, and the water has never once touched that line. Now it's projected to fall further, toward a record low 3,476 feet by March 2027. Remember the order. Because it's cruel, the West loses the power roughly 120 feet before it loses the water. The dam keeps standing. It just stops working. And that hydropower is the exact tool used to manage flows for 40 million people downstream. Downstream, they're already living the cut. Go to New Mexico. Elephant Butte, once the largest man-made lake on Earth, dropped to 9. 6% full in 2026, with officials projecting it could hit 2% of capacity by late August. The dam runs wide open, not to store water, but to shove what's left toward Las Cruces, El Paso, and the treaty water owed to Mexico under a 1906 agreement. In the town of Truth or Consequences, marinas sit in the mud. Down in the Hatch Valley, chili farmers got rationed to 4 inches of water for the season. 4 inches. And a Supreme Court settlement is quietly laying groundwork to retire some of those farms for good. The river doesn't announce its cuts, it just stops showing up. That's how the reckoning actually arrives, not as a wave, but as a fallowed field. Farmers pull about 70 to 80% of the Colorado's water, most of it for alfalfa and hay to feed cattle. So when the system needs to save water fast, the fastest lever is paying farmers to not plant. Leave the ground bare. Take the check instead of the crop. It sounds tidy on a spreadsheet. On the ground, it means a 4th-generation farm goes dormant. The workers who picked and hauled and packed lose the season, and the small town built around that farm starts to hollow out. You don't just follow an acre. You follow a way of living. And here's the trap nobody at that 1922 lodge saw coming. The systems built to move this water are themselves leaking it away. Look at Texas. Medina Lake near San Antonio dropped to 4% full in 2026, 96% empty. Docks stranded dozens of feet above cracked mud. Drought did part of it. But a data expert working with residents found that 75% of every release from Medina Lake never even reaches the farmers it's meant for. It seeps into 110-year-old earthen canals run by the Bexar Medina Atascosa district. A 250,000 acre-feet became a creek, and when a once-in-a-generation flood hit in 2025, the lake still couldn't refill. Century-old infrastructure loses the water faster than the sky can replace it. That's the Colorado's future in miniature. Not a single dramatic failure, but a slow bleed through pipes and ditches nobody funded to fix. So, who blinks first? That's the interstate reckoning grinding forward right now. The 1922 compact split the river between an upper basin Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and a lower basin Arizona, Nevada, California. For 100 years, both sides operated on a fiction that there was enough for everyone's paper allotment. There never was. The guidelines that govern shortage sharing expire in 2026, and the negotiations to replace them have turned into a knife fight over one question. When the river comes up short, and it always will now, whose cut is it? The upper basin says the lower basin must live within a shrinking supply. The lower basin points upstream and says share the pain. Neither side wants to be the one who tells its own farmers, its own cities, its own voters that the water isn't coming. Because somebody has to. The river already made that decision. The states just haven't agreed on how to say it out loud. And the population keeps climbing. Phoenix keeps building. Las Vegas keeps building. The demand curve points up while the supply curve points down. And the reservoir cushion that hid the gap for decades is scraping bottom. There's no wet decade riding to the rescue in the models. The tree ring record, 1,200 years of it, shows the early 20th century, the years they measured the river, were among the wettest in 12 centuries. They didn't just overallocate. They locked in the overallocation using the most generous numbers the sky ever handed out. Which brings it back to that boat. It's surfaced because the water that hit it is gone. And it's not coming back to where it was. Every bathtub ring on Lake Mead's canyon walls is a receipt for water already spent. The Colorado still leaves the mountains as snowmelt, still carves through the red rock, still slides toward the delta. But less of it every year, tapped and traded and fallowed and evaporated, until in Mexico, it now mostly vanishes into the sand before it ever finds the sea. A river that once reached the ocean now disappears into the desert, quietly, the way a debt comes due, not all at once, but a little more each year, until the ground where it used